Okay, actually I have two lectures. Today I will mostly talk on gravitational wave detection and how this was a strong drive for what actually became optomechanics. Um, okay, so the starting point of all this, well, maybe not historically, but for the concept, is a very beautiful experiment which was performed in 2004. So it's a very nice magnetic resonance experiment where you probe the magnetic resonance of this electron spin, of a single electron spin. And the interesting thing is that, contrary to what was usually done, the resonance, so it's created with this radio frequency coil here, but the resonance is detected by mechanical means, which means that when this spin is flipped, what it does, it creates an interaction with this magnetic tip here, which moves this cantilever that you can see here. So it's a very soft and flexible cantilever. Here is a magnetic tip. And this motion is probed by laser interferometry. So you have a very basic laser source, which is sent into a fiber. And so you have the interference between the beam, which is just reflected here at the tip of the fiber, and which goes back like this, and the beam, which goes onto the cantilever and comes back. So it's a very simple two-wave interference. And the interesting thing so that's a typical fringe system that you see. Here is the length different, and here is the reflected intensity detected over here. And the interesting thing is that even though it's a very, from the optics point of view, a very basic experiment, very simple experiment, very cheap experiment for the optics part, still it gives a very high sensitivity. You see that at the time they had a sensitivity on the displacement which is better than 10 to the minus 10 meter. And because this is very flexible, that gave a force sensitivity which was better than 1 attonewton, so 10 to the minus 18 newton. And that was enough to detect the resonance of a single electron spin. So the question is, so interferometry is a very powerful system to probe displacement. And then the question is, if it's so easy to detect such small displacements, is it very interesting to do anything much more expensive or much more complicated? Is there any interesting physical signal worth detecting something small? And the strong drive for this has been for many years, 40 years, the detection of gravitational waves. And the reason is that, so it's been predicted for over a century now, that when you have masses somewhere in the universe, for example, a binary system here, moving at some frequency, this system, according to general relativity, creates what's called gravitational waves. And gravitational waves, what they do everywhere in the universe, and especially on Earth, they create something which is very similar to a tidal force. So when you have such a system, it creates a gravitational wave which travels at the speed of light, and when it comes to Earth, what it does on a system of test particles, which are initially on a circle, it creates a displacement, which has some interesting features. First is that, so the displacement, so the typical displacement here, amplitude, actually is proportional not just to the amplitude of the wave, which is h, but also to the size of the system. So it's something very similar to a tidal force. So you have, if you want to detect this, you have to have a large system. Also, so it oscillates at twice the frequency of this system because it's a quadrupolar effect. And the interesting thing is that the displacement has a pi phase shift between two orthogonal directions. Okay, so it doesn't shrink the circle as a whole. What it does, it creates an ellipse with the axis just moving. Okay, so now what's the amplitude of this? Actually, it's very, very, very small. For a typical system like this, you have m is a typical mass of these two systems, r is size, omega is frequency, 1 over r is the distance between the source and the detection. And the issue is, of course, that you have a prefactor, which is g over c4, which is a very tiny factor in standard units. And actually, if you have a look at the amplitude of the wave, it's impossible to produce such gravitational waves on Earth and to detect them. So you have to rely on astrophysical sources. And if you take two black holes with one solar mass at a distance which is 10 megaparsecs, so that's something like 30 million light years. So it's a very large distance, but it's very small compared to the universe. Then what you expect is an amplitude on the order of 10 to the minus 20. Okay, So it means that, for example, if you have a system which is 1 meter, you have to detect 10 to the minus 20 meter. Okay, so 10 orders of magnitude better than what was done with the atomic force microscopy experiment I just mentioned. And actually, that's at the peak. The amplitude here is at the peak of the system, just before the merger of the system. And the signal lasts for typically for less than 1 second. So you need a sensitivity even better than that, because you can't average for more than a few tens of seconds. Okay, so before, so for today I have basically 4 parts. The idea, I start with just, I don't know if it's a reminder or an introduction to signal and noise processing, just to explain how it works. Then I'll show you how the gravitational wave interferometer, that's Virgo near Pisa, that's a French-Italian gravitational wave interferometer, has been designed and built. I will say a few words about the 2 main gravitational wave detections that have been published recently. And then I will show you how these systems are very interesting systems, are already and will be limited by quantum noise of light, and what we can do to go beyond these quantum limits. Okay. So I start with a very simple system. So it's a Michelson interferometer. So you have laser light, beam splitter, 2 arms. And just imagine that here you have 1 arm which is moving, and you want to measure that displacement. So you have the fringe system which is here. That's the output intensity detected here. That's the length difference between the 2 arms. And so imagine that you work close to a working point, which is here. Okay, so that sets this point. And then you have a tiny displacement, much smaller than the wavelength. So here you have a tiny displacement that creates a length difference. And what you do here, you detect your intensity signal. And provided you work on a good working point, that's linear with your signal here. So that's this 2-wave interference is here, with phi just a phase shift. So the question is, whatever the displacement we have here, we always have an intensity signal. So what does limit the sensitivity? What limits the smallest signal, displacement signal that we can actually monitor with such a system? Okay. So what I do, I just start with this, and I say, okay, so phi is this. I work close to this working point here, and I just imagine I have a small displacement delta xs. So when I do that, this is what I get. I get intensity fluctuations, which are this signal. So this term here just comes, maybe I can show it, from the linearization of L, which one is it? Lx, which is L0 here plus some delta xs. And I just put this in here. But, so that's my signal. Signal is here, so it's minus incident intensity, some term, and 4 pi over lambda times the displacement. But then I have to take into account the fact that not just this moving mirror can be fluctuating, okay, of course. So what can also happen? Well, I can take into account the fact that, of course, the intensity here may fluctuate, and that will also create fluctuations of the detected intensity here. Also, the displacement can be the signal I'm looking for, but it can be pretty much anything else, vibrations. And at last, as I'm measuring not just the displacement, but the displacement divided by the wavelength, of course, if the wavelength fluctuates in time, that will also create some fluctuations. So when I take all this into account, I have my signal here. I have the position noise here, which has exactly the same form as my signal, actually. Also, I have the intensity noise, and I have the wavelength noise, which I wrote here as frequency noise, but it's essentially the same thing, okay? And the interesting thing is that, of course, now if you want to know what limits the smallest displacement that you can monitor with such a system, for example, if it's position noise, as position noise is actually exactly in the same space here as the signal, okay? When I compare this to this, of course, everything else cancels, so that basically my displacement noise, my signal to noise ratio, is just the signal divided by the signal divided by the noise. okay, and nothing else matters. But if I look at other noise, for example, frequency noise, okay, you see that frequency noise is here, signal is here. So if I make the ratio of this term to this term, this is what I get. And you see, for example, that in the case of frequency noise, if I want to cancel frequency noise to have the highest signal to noise ratio, I have to make sure that L0, which is my working point, goes to 0. So setting the working point does change the signal to noise ratio and does change what I can monitor with my system. And also interestingly, if I look now at intensity noise, so I make the ratio of my signal here to this noise here, of course I get something like delta XS, which is the amplitude of the signal divided by the amplitude of the noise. But I've got something interesting here, which is a cotangent. And if I have a look, it's just that, of course, my signal is maximum when I'm here, because that's where the slope is maximum, okay? But actually, if I make the signal to noise ratio, what happens is that, of course, here, signal to noise ratio is 0, because signal is 0, and noise is very high. But if I go here, actually, signal goes to 0, but noise goes to 0 as well, and actually, noise goes to 0 faster than the signal. And actually, the best working point, if I am limited by the intensity noise of the laser, which is here, should be here. And you can see this on this, where is it here? Cotangent, which is optimum if I'm very close to the dark fringe. Okay. So that's something I have to have in mind when I design my experiment. So just a few words about the noise. So typical noise is described by a noise distribution, and in many cases it's a Gaussian noise distribution like this. So here is a probability density function. Here is a draw of something with the typical histograms that I have. And of course, if I have more draws, I get a better realization of the ideal probability density function. And the typical description I can do of such a Gaussian noise distribution, the first way I have to quantify this is just to give its variance. Variance, which is 1 here, which is just the mean, the root mean square. Okay? But that's not sufficient to actually describe my experiment. I don't know if many of you have already done some experiments in a lab, but if you do a very simple experiment, you take a signal generator, which creates a sine wave like this. Amplitude is 1 volt. I think it's at 1 kilohertz. Okay. Plus, you use actually the same kind of signal generator, but you use it as a noise generator, like this. And you can set the RMS value. Here it's 0.4 volt. You add up the two on some electrical beam splitter, and you have a look at what the sum is. So if you do that on a very standard oscilloscope, this is what you get on a single shot. Okay. And if you have a digital oscilloscope, you can just average. And if you average, you know that for 16 averages, this is what you get. For 256 averages, this is what you get. And actually, what you see is that the typical noise here, this size here, okay, actually decreases with the number of averages that you do. That's something which is quite well known. And so actually, your signal, your variance scales as 1 over the square root of the averaging time. Okay, where does this come from? Also, you have to realize, so first, variance is something which depends on the averaging time. And also, variance is not sufficient because it also depends at what frequency your signal is. So here is another numerical experiment. Here is some noise I created with a Python program. Okay, and here is the same noise plus a sine wave, I think, at 10 Hertz. Okay, and here is the same noise plus a signal at 100 Hertz. Okay, and what I did here, I put 10 seconds. Here I put only 1 second. Okay, so my signal at 100 Hertz should look the same here as my signal at 10 Hertz on this. Okay, and obviously, even though that's the same noise and two signals with the same amplitude, you see that it's very easy here to recover the signal at 100 Hertz. You can easily see the oscillations, okay? Whereas here, it's very, well, it's barely impossible just with the naked eye to see any modulation at 10 Hertz, okay? And why is that? It's because actually this noise has, I would say, a preference for 10 Hertz rather than 100 Hertz, okay? So the variance is not sufficient. Here you have some variance, but you see that this variance does not have the same effect for a signal at 10 Hertz and for a signal at 100 Hertz, okay? Okay, so what I have to do is I have to specify, so that's my typical histogram of the noise. Now the question is, how is this histogram actually built in time, okay? So how do the number of occurrences which are here add up within a bin here? Do they stack up first somewhere here and then go slowly like this, stack up here, then stack up here, then stack up here like this, okay? So if they do that, at what rate do they shift from one side to the other side, okay? Or do they just appear here, or and here, and here, and here, I mean completely randomly, okay? So if you want to quantify this, you need to have a look not just at the variance, but at the autocorrelation function. So the autocorrelation function is just the average over time of one occurrence multiplied by the same a bit later in time, okay? And you see that typically if your noise has a very specific time scale, then this will peak at this time scale. So that's the autocorrelation function, and you just define the noise spectrum as the Fourier transform of this. And when you do that, you see, okay, very quickly. So first, okay, that's defined for both positive and negative frequency, but that's just a technical aspect. So first, you recover that the variance, if you have a look at this formula, which is just inverse to Fourier transform, you see that if you put tau equals 0, okay, that's just the Fourier the integral of the spectrum, and here what you get is actually the variance, because the autocorrelation function at tau equals 0 is just the variance. So you see that variance is just the integral of the Fourier, of the spectrum over all frequencies. Okay, so the spectrum is just the amount of noise that you have at a given frequency, and you can filter that noise, because if you have some sort of filter, here you have a linear relationship between an input and an output. That can be, for example, a mechanical filter or an electrical filter. Then you get that kind of relationship between the noise spectrum at the input and at the output. Okay. Maybe I skip this. So an example of noise spectrum. If I have thermal noise, so thermal noise is just the motion of one mechanical resonator under the influence of a random force here, which is called the Langevin force. So I have a typical equation of motion, so that's the restoring force, that's the damping, and here is the equation of motion. Then if I put all this on this side and I take the Fourier transform, I get the mechanical susceptibility, which is the ratio of the displacement over the Fourier transform in Fourier space. And there is a very strong theorem, which is, and we'll talk about that also tomorrow, which is the fluctuation dissipation theorem, which states that the spectrum of this force is actually, so that's the fluctuation part, is actually related to the imaginary part of the mechanical susceptibility, and the imaginary part of the mechanical susceptibility, you see that this, and obviously that's the damping. Okay, that's a very strong relation between fluctuations through Langevin force and damping. Okay, so an example of this is that if I have that's my equation of motion, that's my spectrum for the Langevin force. So what I get is I get the noise spectrum in position. Okay, it's just the filtering squared times the spectrum of the Langevin force, and what I get is the Lorentzian resonance times this. So a typical noise spectrum for displacement of a mechanical resonator, it's peaked at the resonance frequency. Okay, if I have a look here, that's if I make a close-up on this, I see that there is a shape which is Lorentzian and with a width which is given by the mechanical Q of the resonator. And then the noise spectrum goes to some value here at low frequency, and then it goes at 1 over frequency to the fourth power at high frequencies because of mechanical filtering. So that's a typical noise spectrum. And of course, if I make an experiment, well, I'd better do it far away from the mechanical resonance. Because if I make an experiment at this frequency with a typical averaging window, which is like this, I will not be sensitive to this part of the noise spectrum. So I will have a noise which is much, much lower if I work at this frequency, whereas as I work at this frequency. Okay, so with this, I will explain why we building gravitational wave interferometers, we ended up with Michelson interferometers which have 3 kilometer arms, for instance. Okay, so I start, so not with a Michelson interferometer, but with a simpler, just a cavity. So the idea is that I have a cavity, and I want to measure this displacement. Let's say it's created by a gravitational wave, okay? So what I do, I have a look at the phase of the reflected field, and if I work close to an optical resonance, okay, the phase shift of the field by going into and leaving the cavity is what? Is displacement divided by the wavelength, as for a Michelson interferometer, but it's multiplied by the fact that within an optical cavity, the light goes and back many times, potentially many times, and so the phase shift is multiplied by this, and it's called the finesse of the cavity. Okay, so that's my signal. Now I have a look. So what I measure actually is the phase. So if I measure the phase, actually, I'm not sensitive just to the motion created by a gravitational wave. I'm also, and actually I'm very much sensitive to any motion, like vibrations. Okay? So vibrations, that's classical noise, they end up just next to the signal. But also, as I'm measuring the phase, what I have is the signal I detect here is not just this phase shift, but it's a phase shift with this noise, plus the phase noise of the light that goes into the cavity. And so the idea is that if I have a look at my optical field in phase space, that's the real part of the field, imaginary part, so so what my cavity does, it creates a phase shift, which is this, 8f divided by lambda multiplied by the signal. And of course, I have to make sure that this phase shift is actually larger than the phase noise. Phase noise are the fluctuations of the field that I can see from the origin of phase space, so they are basically the angle from which I see the field from the origin of phase space. Okay, and I will talk a bit more about this later, but even if I have a perfect laser light, I have some fluctuations which are related to the quantum nature of light. And so I have here a circle which is just due to the quantum fluctuations of light. And so the phase noise is just the angle from which I see this circle from the origin of phase space. So of course, this circle is just given by the Heisenberg relations. And so this circle is independent of the amplitude of the field. So you see that it's very easy to see that if I have a stronger field, I will be further away from the origin of phase space. And so same circle seen from further away creates lower phase noise. Okay, so that's why the phase noise actually scales as 1 over the power of the field. Okay, so I start first gravitational wave interferometer. So they were the ones which are built at the beginning of the 2000 decade. So I start with the Michelson interferometer. Remember that the gravitational wave effect is proportional to the length of the system. So I have to build an interferometer as big as I can. Okay. So so we ended up with arms on the order of 3 to 4 kilometers. So that's 3 for Virgo, French-Italian interferometer, and that's 4 for the US-based interferometers. There are plenty of reasons for that. First is that of course, it's expensive to build very long baseline interferometers. Plus, you have the diffraction limit. your laser beam is a few centimeters wide here, and after a few kilometers, the diffraction already has increased the optical size of the beam by some factor on the order of 1 or 2. So building a much bigger interferometer would create a much larger optical waste, and that would be a problem because we can't afford such large mirrors. Also, remember that the curvature of Earth, after 3 kilometers, so we are on the ground, after 3 kilometers, the laser beam is already, I think, a few meters above the ground, and so it would create problems, well, engineering problems, but still problems. Okay, so we're stuck with something on the order of a few kilometers. So to increase, what we do is we use not just just one mirror in the arms, but what we do, we put optical cavities into both arms. Okay. So the idea is that if I have an optical cavity which is resonant, then the light will go back and forth many times inside the arms. And typically, if I have, for example, a finesse of 100 for a cavity which is 3 kilometers long, I will have an effective length on the order of 300 kilometers. Also, I told you that for such, maybe I can. Okay. Remember that I told you that we were close to a dark fringe, which means that there is almost no light on the detector here, which means that most of the light actually goes back to the laser source. So in that case, what we do is we put a mirror here, which is called the power recycling mirror, which is set so that the optical wave coming back from the interferometer actually is in phase with the optical wave coming from the laser source, and they just add up, okay? And we reflect the laser wave reflected from the interferometer back into the interferometer in order to increase the laser power into the interferometer. And that helps us to increase the effective laser power. So here it's typically 1 watt, continuous wave at 1 micron, and it goes something similar to 1 kilowatt of optical power. And that's interesting because I said the phase noise scales as 1 over the square root of the optical power. Okay, so if I do this, so I have my phase shift, which is phase noise 1 over the optical power, plus displacement. So displacement is just h times L, okay, created by gravitational wave, divided by lambda, multiplied by 8 times the finesse. So you see that the smallest wave amplitude I can measure, h, okay, is the one which creates this on the same order as this, and it's very easy to show that it is this. And if I plot this with 1 micron, 3 kilometers finesse, and here 1 kilowatt, this is what I get, I think, for a finesse. Here it's a finesse of 5, here it's a finesse of 50, so I gain a factor 10, okay? And if I put 500, another factor 10 here, okay? But you see that it works here, but it no longer works here. And the reason for this is that if you take an arm which is 3 kilometers long with a finesse of 50, it takes 1 millisecond for the light to make the 50 round trips inside the cavity. So it means that after 50 round trips, what happens is that if you have a 1 kilohertz gravitational wave, okay, the gravitational wave has already had enough time to actually flip sign and come back to its original phase. So you have some filtering of the gravitational wave by your optical system. Okay, that's the first order low-pass filter, actually. So that's why if we keep increasing the finesse, what happens is that we go lower and lower here, which is good, but we start going up at lower frequency. Okay. So now I have to take into account the other noise in my system, and an important noise. So here is my mirror. So remember, I want to measure displacement of this on the order. So I want an amplitude on the order of 10 to the minus 20, which means for 3 kilometer arms, a displacement of the mirror on the order of 10 to the minus 17 meters. Okay. And of course, a typical mirror, if I put a mirror here on the table, just the ground vibrations are more or less on the order of 10 to the minus 6 meters. Typical seismic noise, even without earthquakes, is typically 10 to the minus 6 meters. So I have to make sure that this mirror doesn't move more than a few 10 to the minus 18 meters if I want to be able to discriminate a gravitational wave from just earth vibrations. So what I do, I use mechanical filtering. So the idea is that you have some vibration of the noise here. They go up the tower here, and then they are attached to some mass, which is typically this mass here. And this mass here, or this mass here, say, okay, is connected to another mass by first a wire. So maybe you can see a wire here. Okay, it's not that easy. And this wire is connected to the outer frame here of these blades. And these blades, they move like this at very low frequency. Okay. So what happens is that the wire creates a pendulum, which has a typical 1 Hz frequency. Okay. And the blades create also a filter for vertical vibrations, also with a resonance around 1 Hz. Okay. So what happens that the vibrations here, if they are at frequencies higher than 1 Hz, they are filtered by the mechanical filter. Okay. So and typically, and the filtering is 1 over f square. And if we say we will only detect, we only aim at detecting gravitational wave at say 10 Hz or higher frequency. So we have a 10 factor, and it's 1 over f squared. So each filter gives us a factor 100 of filtering. Okay. So 100 is not enough. So what we do is we put 7 filters from the top of the tower to the bottom, and here we have an attenuation factor of the Earth's vibrations by 14 orders of magnitude. Okay, so we know that this mirror here, if it moves, it's not due to ground vibrations. Okay. So seismic noise, if I look at my sensitivity with respect to frequency between 1 Hz and 10 kilohertz, seismic noise, it scales basically as 1 over f to the 14. So it's very, very sharp decrease. Then I have to take into account all other degrees of freedom of my mirrors. And for example, so the mirrors, they are suspended by a pendulum. So this pendulum has thermal noise. And this thermal noise here has a resonance on the order of, I think, 7 Hz. But typically, it gives a noise like this. Then I have to take into account that even the wires here, they have mechanical resonances, because wires, just like guitar strings, they just vibrate at some frequencies. For the first generation, they were still wires, and so the first mode was at 300 Hz, and that you had all other modes, 300, 600, 900, and so on and so on. And so you have spikes, but they are very, very thin. And last but not least, even the mirrors here, the test masses, they have vibration modes, just like drums, okay? Typically like this. So they are very big, typically that's 35 centimeters in diameter, 10 or 20 centimeters in thickness. They are made in very high quality fused silica. And you have here see a vibration mode, and of course for laser beam, which is reflected at the center of the mirror, this looks exactly like global motion of the mirror. Okay, and so okay, maybe not this mode, but the first mode has a resonance at something like 6 kilohertz. There are many more resonances at higher frequencies, but we're not interested so much in them. But also there is some low frequency thermal noise, which is here. So you see that if you take now into account all these noises, what happens is that the sensitivity target, which is 10 to the minus 22 per root hertz here, okay, is basically reached above 10 hertz. So that was the goal of the first generation of Virgo. And so that's the theoretical. So you see, that's why we picked a finesse of 50, because remember that's 50, that's 500, and you see that you have only here, of course, 500 is much better than 50, but you're limited by some other noise. Okay, so the only place where there is some interest in having a finesse of 500 compared to 50 is, let's say, here. Okay, because that's the only place where the noise is actually limited by the optical noise. Okay, and maybe here. So it's a very small improvement. That's why for the first generation, and it's a big problem to handle. So for the first generation, we ended up with a finesse of 50. Okay, so that's this. So that was the target. That's the actual noise curve, which is essentially this, except at low frequency. Here you see that we have a target which is on the order of 10 to the minus 21, I think, at low frequency, and we are more on the order of 10 to the minus, where is it? So that's red curve here, 10 to the minus 20. Okay, so that's Virgo, the red curve, and that's the two US interferometers are green and black are here. So they have a better sensitivity here at the bucket, but they had a lower sensitivity at low frequency because they didn't have the fancy suspension 7-stage system. Okay, so these interferometers, they worked. They took data for a few years, but they didn't detect any gravitational waves. So we improved basically everything. So that's advanced Virgo. So that's the interferometer now working. Well, actually not working today because we are still upgrading things, but it will be back online on April the 1st, so very soon. So we have an even higher laser power here, okay, which is sent also into a Michelson interferometer. So the suspension are the same, but we change the mirror. So now we have a finesse which is 440 because we have a lower thermal noise. When I say we didn't change the suspension, but we changed the mirrors, so they have a better optical quality, but also better mechanical quality, so thermal noise is lower. And just so here is the photodiode which detects the signal. And of course, it's very difficult to handle such a system because you have many, even though you have only one phase shift that you measure here, okay, you have to make sure that all these mirrors are at the right place with the right angle, okay. Remember that this cavity has to be resonant, which means that this length has to be a multiple of the wavelength at a very tiny fraction of the wavelength, okay. So there are local controls to make sure that these mirrors, they don't move. They don't rotate, and so on and so on. For example, here, if you have a look, that's a beam splitter here. And here is the input mirror of one arm. And you see that we have some, I would say, spurious reflections on the mirrors, okay? Because, of course, even an input mirror, there is some tiny reflection. But we make sure that we pick up these signals, and all the fancy, well, very weak signals all over the place, we just pick them up and use them for local controls of all the optics. Okay, and so there are plenty of feedback loops to make sure that this mirror does not move, this mirror does not move. Also, so we have local control, then we have a global control to make sure that this length is set at what it should be. Then we have a global control to make sure that the difference between this and this is set at what it should be, and so on and so on. And all this is processed in real time to make sure that it works. Okay, so all these interferometers, both LIGO and Virgo, they worked until 2010 or 11, but didn't detect anything. So we went to an upgrade phase, and LIGO was back online on September the 12th, 2015. Actually, it should have been online on the 19th, but they started on the 12th. And that was a good idea because actually on the 14th there was a detection just in the middle of the night for the US. So you see the kind of signal that was picked up both in LIGO and Ford, so that's in Washington State, and at the other LIGO interferometer in Louisiana. So the signal, so that the amplitude of the wave, so that here it's 10 to the minus 21, which means that even at the peak here you have a wave on the order of 10 to the minus 21, which means that the mirrors, they only move by 10 to the minus 18 meters, okay? Also, you see that the signal only lasts for less than 1 second, okay? Well, actually, it lasts for many millions of years, but at this time, it's below our detection frequency. So in our detection frequency band, it only lasts for a few tenths of seconds. And so if you check, so these are exactly the two same signals. Well, not exactly, but it's just because they were not at the same time as the detector. If you just shift them by 7 milliseconds, it works. And it's reasonable because you have 3,000 kilometers between the two detectors. So anything below 10 milliseconds is compatible with the fact that just the source is closer to one detector compared to the other. Okay. Also note that to do that, to superimpose the curves, I had to flip one of them. And it's because if you have two detectors like this, they should have the same gravitational wave signal. But what they did, they built the two detectors like this, so that there should be a reverse sign between them. Okay, that's another interesting check of the quadrupolar effect. Okay, and it works. Okay, now if we have a look at this signal, what does it mean? So the interpretation of this is that there were two black holes. So having a look at all this and making a very complicated fit gives you all the details of the trajectories and of the masses. So there were two black holes, 29 and 36 solar masses, orbiting probably for millions of years. Okay, and as they orbited, they radiated gravitational waves, lost some energy, so got closer and closer. So the frequency got larger and larger. And at some point, on September the 14th, well, we got the signal on September the 14th, they reach 30 Hertz, which is the lower frequency that we can achieve for now. Okay, and in just a few tenths of seconds, they orbited it. They made orbit so fast that they got closer and they just merged. Okay, and here you have the merger of the two black holes. Okay, we can also measure the final mass of the black hole, and it's only 62. So it means that if you make the total of this, it's 65. So that means that 3 solar masses were just emitted as gravitational waves in a few tenths of seconds. So I already said. Also we can get the distance because we have the mass, because the time evolution of the frequency here gives us the mass. And so as we have the amplitude, we can get the distance. And the distance is 450 megaparsec, which is more than 1 billion light years, which means that it all happened 1.3 billion light years before September the 14th. Okay, which is much better than 1.3 billion light years before September the 10th, because on September the 10th we couldn't detect anything. And also the interesting thing is that if you have a look, we only had a few cycles, something like 8 cycles observed, and that's the only signal we have on these two black holes, even though they probably made orbits for millions of years. Okay, so that was something like 3 years ago. Actually, I was here in this very room in August 2015, and we were very excited because we said we were about to start using the detectors, but we had no idea that just 2 weeks later we would get such a detection. So now we already detected 10 such events. So it was called GW for gravitational waves, and that's the date. So it gave a direct detection of gravitational wave, of course, a direct observation of a black hole, actually of 2 black holes, merging to create a third one. Also, if we have a careful look at the shape of the waveform, it allows us to test general relativity, because we can compute the waveform according to general relativity, and then we can check. And okay, of course the waveforms are not perfect because there's some noise, especially here, but we have a pretty good test of general relativity with this. The waveform, the polarization. Also, we could check that the wave here, which is at different frequencies, had a non-dispersive propagation. Okay, that's related to the fact that graviton has a 0 mass, well, or a very small mass. We can put an upper bound of the mass, and so we can estimate the rate at which such black hole binaries merge. And that's very interesting because we found a much larger rate than what was expected. So here you have a plot of all the 10 events that we measured during the last two campaigns. Interestingly, you can see that so there were, let's say, 3 during the first run with only Advanced LIGO working, and then there was a second run, and Advanced Virgo was started working around here. And you see that there were 5 events between July the 29th of 2019 and August the 23rd. Okay, so in just 1 month, we got 5 such events. Okay, which is on average we have about 1 per month, when the interferometers work. But the very last month that we took data, we had 5. So the rate was estimated with these 10 events to be somewhere below 10 and 100 per gigaparsec cube. So that's the volume of the universe, and per year. And just to give you an idea, before we had such detections, that rate was more estimated like on the order of 1, not between 10 and 100. So we had many more detection than estimated. So the question is, from the astrophysics point of view, why are there so many binary black holes merging? So there are 2 options. Either, so what's the scenario of this merger here? Okay, there are 2, I would say, from my optics point of view, there are 2 scenarios. Either you have 2 independent black holes and they just eventually orbit and they just merge. And in that case, if there are more binary black holes, it's just because there are more black holes than we thought. Even there are more black holes, okay. Another option, if its scenario is this, is that you have stars which are already in the binary system and they just orbit, and they orbit plus independently they merge, they collapse into a black hole, okay, and then they merge, okay. So that's another option. Maybe there are more binary black holes because black holes tend to be created already as part of binary systems, okay. So with more detection, we can actually check these 2 scenarios, because in this scenario, the 2 systems have more time to actually align their angular momenta, okay, and so that should result in a larger angular momentum of the final black holes. But for now, we can't tell. But that's something interesting to test. Okay, so that first detection was only performed with LIGO, because LIGO was the only interferometer working at the time. But in 2017, Advanced Virgo joined, and just a few weeks later, on August the 17th, around noon, this Fermi Space Telescope issued a gamma ray burst notice, which means that at some time, I think we have all the details, it said, okay, I detected more gamma rays than what I do on average. So that's a typical average signal that they have, and you see that they have a spike. And the interesting thing is that you have an excess, so that's a gamma ray burst, but that's a very short burst because it lasts for less than 1 second. And the interesting thing is that a short gamma ray burst is expected to be created by a binary neutron star merger. And that was the first such short gamma ray burst emitted at the time where gravitational wave interferometers worked. And that's interesting because gravitational wave interferometers are able to detect such binary neutron star merger if they are close enough. So immediately, so there was an automatic alert on the internet, and so we looked at the data, and just 6 minutes later, we got an alert on our side, which was that we had actually a BNS merger, binary neutron star merger. So the alert was set at 12:47, but just because it took 6 minutes to process the data, but the merger happened just a few seconds away from the gamma ray burst. So there were strong signal in both LIGO. You can see it here very easily. That's frequency time diagram. Here you can see it, but you can't see it at all on this plot for Virgo. Here you have the time trace. You see that there is a lot, so that's the fit of the best scenario that we have, and here is the real signal. You see that there is a lot of noise, but there is some reason for that. I will explain. So the false alarm rate of this was set below 1 per 10,000 years, so it's a very plausible signal. So we had to check. So interesting thing is that using all these signals, we were able to locate the source. how does it work? If you have a source which is very far away, that obviously is the case, compared to 3,000 kilometers between the two LIGO detectors, then the time difference between the detection here and the detection here gives you the angular, the angle, and it says that the source is somewhere on this. And so that's for 4 milliseconds. So if we do that for both LIGO interferometers, this is what we get. The source is somewhere here. And if we also take into account Virgo, okay, we know that it's either here or here. Okay. Also, looking at the amplitude of the signals helps us and tells us that actually it's here. How does it work? Remember that the two LIGO interferometers, they are like this, okay? But Virgo is much further away, and because of the curvature of the Earth, it's actually something like this. So it has a very different angle compared to the two LIGO interferometers, okay? And as there is some antenna pattern, the projection of the gravitational wave on the detector is not the same. So actually that's why we had a smaller signal. So we had this, and the interesting thing, you see that so the typical area in the sky is on the order of 30 square degrees. So that's a pretty big, that's typically something like this, but still it's much better than what would have been with just two interferometers. And so that's obviously space coordinates. If we look at Earth-related coordinates, actually the source originated from this point. So of course it doesn't come from Madagascar, but what it means that if you are at the center of the Earth, you have to look through Madagascar to go to the source. And if you have a look, so that's the Virgo antenna pattern. So Virgo is most sensitive to sources which are just here, just above Pisa, where it's located, okay, just coming perpendicular to the detector, to Pisa or through New Zealand from the other side of the Earth, and has some nodes. And you see that actually Madagascar is pretty close to the Virgo node, and that's why the signal was so weak in Virgo. That was a good reason. That was a good reason also, but interesting, because having such a small signal helped us to locate the source. Okay, so having actually so this 30 square degrees, plus the fact that we give a distance with some uncertainty, but still we give a distance, so it gives a volume in the universe. And this volume, there were only 50 galaxies. And we knew that the binary neutron star had to be in one of these galaxies. So what astronomers had to do is they just had to check for all these 50 galaxies. And actually, they found some new star just here. Okay, so that's the first telescope SWAP which detected the new star. And you can compare 3 weeks before. So that's a picture that's the same as this one, well, with a different exposure time. That's the same picture 3 weeks before. You see that there is no such spot, and you can make the difference, and you see easily the new star. Okay. And the interesting thing is that so we had the electromagnetical counterpart of the gravitational wave event. And so we could check, and we could see very interesting thing. Well, astronomers could do an interesting thing. For example, in just a few days, you see that the color of the star changed, as expected. Also, the magnitude of the star changed in time. Okay, so that's typically just a few days. So it's, I like this plot because it's very, we can't put any more points. You see here that's detection in Chile, detection in Australia, detection in Africa, and back in Chile, Australia, and so on. Okay, so if you want a point here, well, you need to build a telescope in the middle of the ocean, so it's a bit complicated. So that's also you see that why it was interesting to actually pinpoint the source very fast, because otherwise we would have missed this point. And of course, this curve, which increases and then decreases, is more interesting than just some sort of exponential decay that you can see here. Astronomers in Chile, they had about a few hours to prepare themselves. Okay, so they programmed their telescopes to check quickly at all 50 galaxies and they took, you see, so they had the localization, I think, 6 hours before the merger, and they had to wait for the night. And then they detected it in 10.86 hours after the merger, and this one just a few minutes later. But okay, So with this, we could do many things. Confirm the origin of short gamma ray bursts, that they are related to binary neutron star merger, because exactly at the same time, we had a binary neutron star waveform. We could confirm all the details, basically the fact that the color changes in just a few days, and this curve, everything perfectly fitted with the model of binary neutron star mergers. Also, in the spectrum of this star here, we could see the spectroscopic signature of heavy elements, like gold or something like this. So it confirms that probably gold is created during binary neutron star mergers, not in ordinary stars. But also, as we detected the gravitational wave at the same time as the gamma ray burst, within about 1 second, it confirmed that gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. Okay, 1 second of difference compared to 100 something million years. Okay, so it's very good accuracy, and that's interesting because you know that there are many theoretical models of gravity, and about half of them say that gravitational waves do not travel at the speed of light. So in just one paper, we just killed half the models. And also, we could measure the Hubble constant by looking at the spectroscopic signature of the star, because we have the distance. We have an independent distance of the star, and so that was the first measurement. Okay, so now I go back to the optomechanics, and I just summarize what's interesting about gravitational wave signal and why it is still interesting to always increase the sensitivity. So you see here the gravitational waves, the binary black holes system, the binary neutron star. In both cases, of course, the signals are very low, typically 10 to the minus 18 meters. They can be very short, on the order of a few milliseconds. They change, they have different frequencies. It starts at a few tens of hertz, ends up here around a few hundreds, possibly a few kilohertz. Okay. And even though we already detected them, it's always interesting to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Why? It's before the merger, it would be interesting to have a better signal-to-noise ratio because we could test the waveform with more accuracy. Okay, here obviously we can say that it fits with a theoretical model, but clearly there are a lot of noise spikes, so it would be interesting to have better signal-to-noise ratio. After the merger, it would be interesting because you see that there is a decay, which is some sort of an exponential, but we can say that it decays, but we can't really test the models just after. Also, as the signal decreases as 1 over the distance, if we have a better signal-to-noise ratio, we can probe a larger part of the universe and so detect more signals. Okay, so there is still a big effort to further increase the sensitivity of gravitational wave interferometers. Okay, so I go now to the quantum limits and beyond part. So, so I start this part by reminding you that the quantum fluctuations of light are something very peculiar. So just to give you an idea, here I put the intensity noise of a laser. So how is it done? Basically, we take a laser. Okay, so it's a YAG laser, so that's the same as in gravitational wave interferometers. And then we send it over a 50-50 beam splitter. So here I have a beam splitter. And I detect the intensity on 2 photodiodes. And here I can make the sum or the difference of the 2 photodiodes. Okay? So first, what I do is I send, okay, let me have a look. I send, well, let's say 12 milliwatt on just 1 photodiode, okay? So I said here 12 milliwatt, I block this, and I just detect 12 milliwatt on this, let's say on this photodiode. Then I do the same for just 6 milliwatt, so that's the purple curve, okay? So if I say that my intensity should be something like mean value times a function of time, where this is so that the mean value, and that all the fluctuations are in this. Then I should have the noise spectrum, okay, should be something like I0 square SF, because that's just a constant here, okay? So if I increase the intensity by a factor 2, okay, I should have a factor 2 square, so factor 4, so 6 dB, okay? That's exactly what I have here, 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 and here. I have 6 dB, okay? But surprisingly, here I no longer have 6 dB, I only have 3 dBs, okay? Okay, then what do? I take my 12 milliwatts, and I send them not just on one photodiode, but I effectively split them, and I send 6 milliwatts here and 6 milliwatts here, okay? And I do the experiment. So I have its red curve, okay? So of course, what I do is I just subtract the noise, so I have a much lower noise, but still, so here I have something like 70 or 60 dBs, but still it doesn't go to 0. And you see that actually it goes to some value here, okay? And if I decrease the intensity by a factor of 2, I do the same with my 6 milliwatt split in 2. Also here, I no longer have the 6 dBs that I have here. I only have 3 dBs. And finally, you see that if I send my 12 milliwatts on this, on just one photodiode, I get this, and I get the same noise level at some frequencies that if I actually split my 12 milliwatt on 2 photodiodes. Which means that if I send 6 milliwatts here and here, if I do the difference of the noise, or if I do the sum, because detecting 12 milliwatts here is the same as detecting 6 milliwatts here and making the sum, okay, I get the same noise level. Okay, so that's something very weird. I have 2 signals on 2 separate photodiodes, and if I add them or if I subtract them, I get the same noise level. That's exactly what I have here with the black curve and the red curve. So how can I explain this? So actually, it's just because I cannot describe quantum intensity fluctuations by such a model. What I have to do is I have to say that a light field, so it's let's say a complex amplitude, but its quantum description goes to an operator which is a photon creation operator. Okay, you know that there is A and A dagger with this. Okay, maybe I'll just so what happens if I have a beam splitter? So if I have some, so that's real part of the field, imaginary part of the field. If I have some classical, I would say, classical light field, so I have some mean value, plus I have some fluctuations here. If I put a beam splitter, what happens? Is that I get a 1 over the square root of 2 of this, and here I decrease the mean amplitude, I also decrease the fluctuations, and actually here I have a copy, a smaller copy, but a copy of this, which means that even not just the size of the distribution, but even the details of the fluctuations are the same. If I have a look in time, if I have some noise going like this here, I will have exactly, I'm not sure I'll be able to do it, but okay, I will have the same pattern here, just smaller. That's classical noise. Okay. In the case where I have quantum fluctuations, okay, so quantum fluctuations, so it's at a much smaller scale, so everything will happen around here. Okay, I'll just increase the size of the drawing to help you see it. But so if I have quantum fluctuations, what happens? So I have a mean value plus quantum fluctuations. So let's say I'm looking at okay, at the field which is reflected here. So first, what the beam splitter does, it does exactly the same thing as for a classical noise, which means that here I have a smaller amplitude and I have smaller fluctuations and I have the same copy of the pattern like this. But when I look at the level of quantum fluctuation, I have to take into account that the fact that here, maybe I can make I have vacuum, and this vacuum has no mean value, but it has quantum fluctuations. And what happens that here I have, so that's vacuum is here, and if I have a pattern which is, let's say, like this here, what I get is that half this pattern also goes into the fluctuations here. Okay, so I end up here, if I just take this pattern and add this one, I just get something which has 50% correlation with this, 50% correlation with this. Okay, so intensity noise has a very different evolution with losses and intensity than classical noise. So in the end, what happens is that when I decrease the intensity, in the case of classical noise, I just decrease the noise. In the case of quantum noise, what I do is I decrease the noise plus I add some noise which can have the same order of magnitude. So I don't change the scaling of the noise. Okay, so how does it work in our system? So remember, I told you that the gravitational wave interferometer work close to a dark fringe. Okay, which means that most of the light is actually reflected to the laser source. Which means that from the outside point of view, either from the laser source or from the detector point of view, this gravitational wave interferometer is just like a mirror, and actually a pretty good mirror. Okay, most of the light which goes here comes back. Okay, which means that if I have a look to the interferometer from the detector point of view, actually it also is a mirror from this side. This explains that actually the noise of the light that we see here is actually not related to the noise of the laser source, but it's related to the vacuum noise which is here and which is just goes into the interferometer and is reflected. Okay, so if we want to increase the sensitivity, if we want to lower quantum noise, we don't have to do anything with the laser source. What we have to do is we have to change the vacuum here. Okay, so how is it possible? Actually, it's possible because vacuum from the quantum optics point of view, vacuum is just either the n equals 0 state or the coherent state alpha equals 0. That's the same. Okay. So here you have a state which has zero mean value but still has quantum fluctuations. Okay, so what we want to do is take advantage of the fact that what quantum mechanics says, that if we say that this x is the real part and y is the imaginary part of the field, like this, then what we have is delta x, delta y larger than 1. And actually here we have delta x equal 1, delta y equals 1. But we can imagine to have, let's say, delta x smaller than 1 at the expense of delta y larger than 1. Okay? And as the phase fluctuations are related to delta y, okay, we can imagine to actually decrease the phase fluctuations if we need to, as long as we're not sensitive to the other quadrature. So how do we do that? We use nonlinear crystals. So the idea is that, so if you have, here you have the polarization of some nonlinear crystal, and here you have the electric field amplitude. So if you have a polarization which is linear with the field, so that's the usual index of reflection part of the polarization, plus something which is quadratic, what happens is that here the curve is just not just a slope, it's actually really curved. So if I shine a laser field which is a mean value 0, which is vacuum, okay, so mean value is 0, plus you see fluctuations, just vacuum quantum fluctuations, okay, and I add up a pump field which is exactly at twice the frequency of my vacuum at omega 0. Okay, if I do that, so I just take this plus this is my blue curve here, so I have something at 2 omega 0 plus some fluctuations. Okay, then this total electric field is distorted by the nonlinear relationship between the field and the polarization. Okay, which means that my polarization inside the crystal actually is different, because basically because the slope here is different from the slope here, so I have more noise you see here than I have noise here. Okay, so this nonlinear polarization now creates some radiation, and in that radiation I get something which is proportional to this, and this I can decompose it into something at twice the frequency. This is exactly what is shown here, plus something at 4 times the frequency. That's because here I have twice the frequency and I have some quadratic interaction here. Plus, you see the fact that the noise is lower here than it is here. So what it does is that starting from noise, which is, I would say, flat in time, it creates some amplitude modulation of the noise. And this amplitude modulation of the noise actually is exactly what we need to go from something like this to something like this, where I have more noise on one quadrature and less noise on the other quadrature. So we do that with a nonlinear crystal. So an experiment done at LIGO some years ago. So the idea is that here you have the typical gravitational wave interferometer. So what we do, what they did, sorry, is they picked up a part of this laser, the main laser of the interferometer, send it, where is it, here, okay. So they use that 1064 nanometer light, okay, to drive a nonlinear crystal, sorry, which creates the 2 omega 0, which is here, okay. Then this green light is sent into, where is it? It's sent like this, into this cavity where there is another nonlinear crystal, and this nonlinear crystal is the one here, which actually creates the squeezed vacuum. And this squeezed vacuum is sent at the output of the detector. You see that the output of the detector is here. So exactly here, it goes at the output of the detector, and then it's sent on the detection photodiode. So what they did, they demonstrated, you see, sensitivity enhancement. You see that in green you have the typical reference noise of LIGO at the time. Okay. Remember that in that case, the noise, the limiting noise was basically a suspension noise at low frequency. So changing the quantum noise doesn't change anything. Thermal noise here, so changing quantum noise doesn't do anything. But at on the lower, the higher part of the spectrum, the noise was limited by optical noise, quantum optical noise, and so they were they were able to detect a sensitivity improvement by just a few dB. I think that's 2 or something dB. So how come it was just a few dB improvement? It's because when you have squeezing, you are very sensitive to optical losses. Okay, because optical losses are basically like going onto a beam splitter. When you are, let's say, 50% optical losses, it's just like being mixed with vacuum on a 50-50 beam splitter. And if you do that, of course, so even if you start with a strong squeezing, you see that this is much larger than this here. Okay. What you get at the output of this beam splitter is just a 50% mixture of this with a 50% of this. And even though this is strongly squeezed, this is no longer so strongly squeezed. And of course, the stronger squeezed you are here, the more sensitive you are to losses. So that's why if you detect the output squeezing after losses with respect to squeezing input, if you don't have any losses, then of course that's a straight line. Okay, that's 10, and here you have 10. Okay, but if you have a bit of losses, which means here if you have a beam splitter which is 95% transmission, 5% reflection, okay, then at some point you are limited by the noise coming from here. And you see that if you have a 50-50% beam splitter, no matter what you do here, you are always limited to 3 dB squeezing. Because even though you have perfect squeezing here, so there, let's say there is no noise at all, you still have the 50% here, you still have the 50% of the squeezing which is produced here, and so 50% of the standard quantum noise is just 3 dB squeezing. So the problem with gravitational wave detectors, maybe you can see it here, is that here you have a nonlinear crystal which is very tiny. The optical weight here is a few hundreds of microns. Here you have 3 kilometer interferometer arms, and the typical size of the spot here is 5 or 6 centimeters. Okay, so there are plenty of optics to adapt your beams to one to another. Plenty of optics to go through, plenty of optics to be reflected on, and so up to now we are still limited by the fact that we have at least 30 or 40% of losses going from very small beams to very large beams. Okay, I'll just start the second part. So what we did for now, we demonstrated the fact that we can shrink phase noise in order to increase the sensitivity at higher frequency when we are limited by phase noise. So the idea is that, okay, then if we can do that, how far can we go with such a technique? Actually, we're also limited by the fact that I only here spotted a few noises, but there are one more which is very important, which is the fact that you see here that there is, of course, phase noise, but there is also amplitude noise. The same quantum fluctuations, they also create amplitude noise. And amplitude noise creates some intensity noise inside the cavity. So it creates radiation pressure noise inside the cavity. And as you have a moving mirror, well, a moving mirror which has some radiation pressure fluctuations has displacement fluctuations related to that force fluctuations. So actually I have to take into account an additional displacement here, which is just the fact that even the laser field creates some additional displacement. That's a very tiny effect, because radiation pressure is a very tiny thing, and quantum fluctuations are very tiny in general, but actually it's not completely negligible. So if I take this into account, what happens is that I already told you that this, I can decrease it by increasing the laser power. Okay, so that's one option. But if I increase the laser power, of course, I decrease this, but I increase the radiation pressure noise. And what happens is that if I look at the sensitivity of my gravitational wave detector with respect to frequency, and if I only take into account quantum noise, I have my phase noise, which is here, which is flat in frequency, if I don't take into account the filtering because of the cavity length, but so it's flat in frequency. So if I increase the power, I can go below, okay? But I also have the quantum radiation pressure noise, which is not flat in frequency at all, because it involves the mechanical response of the suspended mirror, okay? So the idea is that the radiation pressure is independent on frequency, but the response of the mirror is not. So that's what creates this dependence with the frequency. And if I increase the laser power, now what I do is I just increase this radiation pressure noise. So if I take into account these two noises, you see that I can increase the sensitivity here, decrease it here. Actually, the sensitivity will always be above this line, okay? And that's called the standard quantum limit. So because of the opposite dependence with power, I can never go below that standard quantum limit using standard laser light. So there are different options to go beyond that standard quantum limit. The first one is to reduce the amount of noise, and that's squeezing. The other one is to make a noise-independent measurement. So I'll show you how we can make a measurement where we can cancel the radiation pressure. Or there is another, well, there are a few options I'll just discuss later. Okay, maybe I'll just finish by explaining that here I explained that even if I change the power, I cannot go below the standard quantum limit, okay? But actually, even using squeezing, it's difficult to go below standard quantum limit. Why? So let me, where is it? So here, this dashed curve is a standard sensitivity of gravitational wave interferometers. Yes, using, wait, no squeezing, so it's this one here, okay? So if I don't change the power, but I change the squeezing, for example, if I put phase squeezing like this, what I do is I can decrease the noise at high frequency, where I limit it by phase noise, okay? So I can get some improvement here. But if I do this, what happens is that when I have phase squeezing like this, I have more noise on the amplitude, okay? So more radiation pressure noise. So that's why this curve, it's better at high frequency, but it's worse at low frequency when I'm sensitive to radiation pressure noise, okay? Another option would be to do amplitude squeezing. So starting from this, I can decrease radiation pressure noise, but when I'm sensitive no longer to radiation pressure noise, but to phase noise, it's worse. So I have this curve, okay? Also, if I don't make neither phase nor amplitude squeezing, but something just in the middle, I can get this, which means that when the two noises are at the same level, I get a strong improvement, but I degrade the sensitivity over there. What would be interesting, and I think I'll stop here, is to make squeezing, both phase squeezing here, so to decrease this noise, and also amplitude squeezing at low frequency. So it seems a bit weird, because phase squeezing basically is delta y below 1. I want phase squeezing here. I want amplitude squeezing here, which is delta x below 1. So it seems difficult to still get this product larger than 1, okay? And I explain to you tomorrow that actually it's possible because we are not talking about the same modes. Because I want this at frequencies larger than say 100 Hertz, and I want this at frequencies smaller than 100 Hertz. Okay? And actually, so when I say X and Y, they are not the same X and Y. Okay? There is some X and Y for, actually there are X and Y at every frequency. So what I want is that all X and Y for frequencies larger than 100, I want this squeezing. For all X and Y at frequencies smaller than 100, I want this. And I can do this. Okay? Okay, I guess I'll stop here and I'll continue tomorrow. Thank you. Okay, so the strong reason is that the data perfectly fits with the models. I mean, it's this waveform, okay, is very specific from general relativity and gravitational wave. Okay, a signal which is so weak, which is quadrupolar, which means that there is exactly a -1 sign difference between the two LIGO interferometers, 3,000 kilometers away, plus which has exactly this frequency dependence here. Okay, it's very okay. So that was the main reason when we detected this event. Okay, for the binary black hole. For the binary neutron star, we have one more reason. It's just what we said, that they should find a merger within this area in the universe, and they did. They found the electromagnetic counterpart, which was exactly what was expected for a binary neutron star system. Okay, so we had two signals. We claim this signal is the gravitational wave for a binary neutron star system, and we say, and it's among these 50 galaxies. Remember that there are something like 10 to the 11 galaxies in the universe. And we said, you should, if you look at only these 50 galaxies, you should find a binary neutron star merger. And they did. I mean, we had one chance over 1 billion to actually point the good galaxies in the sky, and we did. So I think it's a pretty strong okay, so yes, there was 1.7 seconds between the gamma ray burst. So let me remind. No, the gravitational wave was detected 1.7 seconds before the gamma ray burst. Okay, and it's basically because the processes that create the gamma ray burst actually are expected to take a few seconds. So it's completely compatible with what we say. Basically, the idea is gravitational wave is something which doesn't interact with matter. That's why it's so difficult to detect. So just at the moment of the merger, they just leave and go on. Whereas for the gamma ray burst, there are some complicated nuclear processes which take about a few seconds. So I think the idea is that it takes between 0 and 10 seconds. So anything between 0 and 10 seconds is completely compatible with what we know about. And still that's 1.7 seconds compared to 140 million years. So it's 10 to the minus 16, I think, accuracy. Ouais. Oh, it's mostly okay. Okay, I can show you one tomorrow if you want. It's just no, something I think I have something like this. Okay, so when there is a merger of two black holes, we don't expect so much light because black holes don't emit light. So there can be light because whatever is around the black holes is strongly accelerated and there is some friction and there is okay. But every time we detected binary black hole mergers, astronomers had a look and they never found anything. But we don't expect to find so much anyway. But yes, actually, we are not sure they are black holes. What we say, what we know, we are for sure the masses. We are sure about the masses, and also we know. You see that frequency here, so it's 250 hertz just before the merger. It gives us the distance between the two just before the merger, and that distance was something like 200 and something or 300 kilometers. So it means it's two very heavy objects, 30 solar masses, smaller than 150 kilometers. So the only astrophysical objects that we know, as for now, with such characteristics are black holes. So maybe it's something even more strange. I don't know, but there is no specific signature of black holes. We know the size and we know the mass. Mm. There is no fundamental theorem. There is, well, actually, I would say 5 years ago, we would have said that at some point we will be ultimately limited on Earth by gravity gradient noise, which is the fact that when we have mirrors, okay, of course we can isolate them from ground vibrations, but if there is a cloud in sky which passes through, okay, it creates some temporary gravity and actually shakes the mirror a bit, and of course we can't cancel that. So that's a noise that we will never get rid of. Okay, and actually it's not. We are pretty close to that noise level, just a factor of 5 or 10 now. So just gravity gradient, the fact that water, the tides, everything moving creates some local acceleration. But what changed is that, okay, we can't get rid of the noise on the test masses, but what we can do is make an array of sensors all around the test masses, measure the acceleration on all these sensors everywhere, and compute what, because they see the same sources, okay, and compute the expected acceleration of the test masses due to all these perturbations. That's called a Newtonian noise cancellation. And maybe 10 years ago for sure, maybe even 5 years ago, we were not very confident in being able to do that. And actually now we are confident, reasonably confident, that we will at least suppress it by a factor of 5, maybe 10. We should be able to measure and to subtract the effect of this on the signal. So there is no fundamental limit. We can always go bigger, cancel, but even Newtonian noise, which was supposed to be a fundamental limit on Earth, that's why LISA, the space-borne gravitational wave detector, also project was created to go at much lower frequencies. But well, it seems people keep having ideas, so maybe there is no such limit. At some point, okay, there is one limit. It's that at some point we will have so many events that I'm not sure what we will be able to do is with this sensitivity we had about one event every 16 days. when the interferometers were running. But with the sensitivity that we have now, so that we'll start using on April the 1st, we should have something like one event every 2 days, one binary black hole. When we reach the design sensitivity in 2 or 3 years, we should have maybe one event every day, and there are plans for even better gravitational wave interferometers in 15 or 20 years, where we should get so many events. Maybe it would be almost a statistical study. Different sources. For example, we expect to see many more binary black holes. Many. Okay. For the next, yes, the size. So maybe go to even larger size. Also go underground to cancel as much as possible that Newtonian noise. Also go to low temperature to decrease the thermal noise. Use better materials. I mean, there are plenty of, the shopping list is very long. And I mean, all the options seems possible. It's just that at some point we will have to. Also, one thing which is very important is that now we have a detector which is optimized both at low frequency and high frequency. That's why it's complicated, because the noises are very different. The idea now is to have 2 detectors, one for low frequency and one for high frequencies. And actually, it's much easier to work. Because it's very complicated. You see that the mirror, I guess, yeah, okay. This mirror here, okay, it's in vacuum. It's suspended by very thin, now it's silica fibers. And here, the optical power is in the order of a few hundreds of kilowatts. So even though the absorption is very small, 10 to the minus 6, less than 1 ppm, still it gives heating, which is only at the center of the mirror. And you have to get rid of that heat, not through vacuum, of course, not through radiation because you are at low temperature. And so the only way to get the heat out is to go through these very tiny links here, which are, well, here is silica fibers. So it's very complicated. So Kagra, the Japanese interferometer, which is supposed to be online in 1 or 2 years, they use sapphire substrate, sapphire mirrors, with also sapphire fibers here, and they will operate at, I think, 100 something Kelvin, and that's already a huge cryogenic challenge. Yeah. Okay, so it depends on the interferometer. For Virgo, it's magnets. We have, I think, 4 tiny magnets at the back of the mirror. Okay, and we have coils. Okay, just to. So I think they are on the square, so you can either move them like this or like this or like this. Okay. And for LIGO, I'm not sure they have magnet, but they also have electrostatic drives. They have some sort of capacitors with funny shapes, and they use the fact that this is a dielectric. So if you apply a voltage, there is some dielectric force, and also they can move the mirror like this, like in any direction. In advanced Virgo, there. Okay, I'm not sure. You mean here? Yeah, well, it's just because when you have 200 watts of optical power, so that's in a fiber amplifier. Here, the mode shape is not a perfect Gaussian, okay, and also there is some intensity noise. It's not just quantum noise. There is some classical intensity noise. There is some pointing noise, okay, And so all this is filtered by this input mode cleaner. Okay, so here we have a laser beam which is very nice to fit perfectly with the modes of the TM00 modes of the optical cavities, which has a very low pointing noise, so it's very stable, and also the intensity is also stabilized. Well, it's just because when you operate a laser, especially a 200 watt laser, it's a lot of optical power, and it's a lot of cold water running to chill the active medium, and it's a lot of vibration, and so it's not very clean just at the output of the laser. So you use just both active systems feedbacks, but also just a cavity which just gives a passive filtering. Okay.